Hello students, this video is for Unit 1, Lesson 6 in Common Core Geometry. This one is about the midpoint formula. We're going to be talking about how to find the midpoint of a line segment using a formula and the idea behind it. In other words, for any midpoint, it's going to be halfway in between the x values of the 2 points and halfway between the y values of the 2 points. That's the basis of this entire formula. Starting out, we know the learning target is always on the top of the page. It says I can determine the midpoint or the end point of a line segment using the midpoint formula. So sometimes the problem will give you two endpoints and ask you to find a midpoint. Sometimes it'll say, here's one endpoint and here's a midpoint, find the other endpoint. The do now is fairly straightforward. It asks you to graph these 2 points and then find the distance in simplest radical form. Pause the video, try this one out, and see if you got it right. And here's that correct answer. The correct answer is going to be 5 radical 2. One thing that you could have done is set up the graph and found a Pythagorean triple for that, or sorry, use the Pythagorean theorem for that. Or another thing you could have done is using the distance formula. Either way, you would have gotten the same answer, which is 5 radical 2. The square root of 50 simplifies to 5 radical 2. All right, the two basic pieces of information that we're going to be talking about today are what the midpoint is and what the midpoint formula is. Midpoint is halfway between the two endpoints of a line segment. So if I give you this line segment AB, the midpoint is going to be halfway between. In other words, the distance from A to M is going to be the same as, congruent to, the distance from M to B. Another way to think about it is that the midpoint is bisecting this line segment. Remember, bisecting from a previous lesson. And one way that we can represent that fact is by putting these two dash marks or hash marks or tick marks onto the line segment. From A to M is one tick mark. That's the same as from B to M, which means that they are congruent. One other important piece of information here is the fact that it splits the line segment into the ratio of 1 to 1. We're going to be talking about ratios a lot over the course of the next couple of lessons. In other words, the ratio 1 to 1 means this piece is exactly the same measurement as this piece. 1 to 1 means 1 part to 1 part. If this piece was 2 times as big as this piece, the ratio would be 2 to 1. All right, next, the midpoint formula. It's a formula that kind of looks similar to the distance formula in some ways, but it's a little bit different. Keep in mind that one of the differences is that we're using x1 and x2 both in the same expression here, and we're also using y1 and y2 in the same expression here. Here's the way I want you to think about the midpoint formula. The midpoint formula is just saying I'm going to take both x values and add them together, divide by 2. In other words, it's the average of the two x values. And similarly, it's the average of the two y values. Another important difference is that the midpoint is a point, so it should have an x and a y value. So instead of getting one value out like the distance formula, the midpoint is going to have two values, one value for the x, one value for the y. Take a look at example number 1. It asks you to find the midpoint of each line segment. In this example, the line segment goes from this point, which is -1, -1, all the way down to -5, -5. So in order to find the midpoint, it's fairly easy to see it just by using the old eyeballs here, just by observing that this point is directly in between, but it's not always going to be quite so straightforward like this example. So let's try to use our formula to try to get this answer, which we already know is -3, -3. Try it out by using that midpoint formula that was given to you up here. So just like any other problem, we're going to write out that formula first, and then we're going to try to substitute the values into the formula. In order to substitute values, we need to identify the ordered pairs for both of these. So let's do that now. And here we've identified both of the points. This blue point is -1, -1, and this green point is -5, -5. Now we can identify which one is x1, which one is x2, and it really doesn't matter. Most of the time we try to do it from left to right, but as I said, it really doesn't matter. So here we'll call this point, the green point, as point 1, and then this blue point is point 2. All right, now our labels are in place. We're ready to start substituting into the formula. x1 is -5, x2 is -1, etc. We substitute in. Now we're going to simplify and evaluate. So our final answer here should be -3, -3. Keep in mind that we're talking about a point here, -3, -3. So we need to encapsulate these, capture them into a pair of parentheses. Amazing. All right, moving on to the next example. And just like before, we have 2 points, but unlike before, we have the points actually in ordered pairs. So it's a little bit easier to throw these into the midpoint formula. And as a quick reminder, you do have to memorize this formula. So now that we have it written down, we can identify y1, x1, etc. And in this example, it's a little bit more straightforward because this is the first point that I see, this is the second point that I see. Might as well use it like that. Now let's substitute and solve. You can see that x1 is -1, so we put it here. x2 is 5, so we put it here. and so on. Now it's easy enough to combine like terms on the top and divide by 2. So there's our final answer. We have negative 4 over 2 here and positive 4 over 2 here. We simplify to just 2, negative 2. So there's our midpoint. Easy enough. If the problem asks us to do it another way, find the other endpoint of the line segment with a given endpoint and midpoint, we have to use the same formula but a little creatively. Here's how we do it. This question is asking us to think about it like this. If one of the endpoints is 2, 5 and the midpoint is 5, 1, what's the other endpoint? So you can use the midpoint formula to say, well, this one is x1, y1, and this is the midpoint, the solution, the thing that we should get at the end. This point has to be x2, y2. So we should be able to substitute those values into the formula and sort of back solve. Let's see how it looks. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. In order to get this 5 from the midpoint, I had to do 2 plus some number, x2, divided by 2. And in order to get this 1 from the midpoint, I had to do 5 plus some y value divided by 2. Now what I can do is take each of these individual pieces and split it into its own little equation. I'm only solving for x2 and I'm only solving for y2. Here's how it looks. So in order to get the x value, I said 5, the x value of the midpoint, is equal to 2, the first x value, plus whatever the second x value is divided by 2. If I solve this one little equation for x2, I'll get that answer. Let's do that now. In this, my first step is to multiply both sides by 2 to eliminate this 2 as the denominator, and then I get 10 is equal to 2 plus x2. Then I'm subtracting 2 from both sides to get 8 equals x2. So my first value for x2 is going to be 8. Next, I can do the same thing on this side to solve for y2. Again, my first step is going to be to multiply both sides by 2 to get rid of this 2 in the denominator. Then once I multiply both sides by 2, I'm going to get 2 equals 5 plus y2. Keep in mind, my multiplying this side by 2 didn't change the numerator, it just eliminated the denominator. Now I got to subtract 5 from both sides and I get negative 3 is equal to y2. I found my endpoint. My endpoint is 8, negative 8. And if you like alternate methods, well, boy, you're in luck, because I'm going to show you an alternate method of how to get this same exact problem. It's called the jump method. What I need to do is try to figure out from this point to this point how much I jumped by the x and the y, and then jump that same amount to get to the end point, the x and the y. Let's take it from x's first. In order to get from this x value, which is 2, to this x value, which is 5, I jumped upwards by 3. In other words, to get from this end point to this midpoint, I traveled on the x direction horizontally upwards by 3. Or forwards by 3, I should say. Now, in order to get from the midpoints to the endpoint, remember, a midpoint is directly in the middle. It's the same number of jumps on the x-axis and the same number of jumps on the y-axis. So I need to go 3 higher on the x-axis in order to get to my endpoint, which means I have to add 3. 5 plus 3, that gives us 8. Math checks out. Next, I have to figure out what happens to the y values. Well, from this value, 5, to this value, 1, the next y value, I went downwards by 4. That's a jump of negative 4. So that means if I go from one endpoint to the midpoint, going downwards by 4 on the y-axis, I got to go downwards by another 4 on the y-axis. And lo and behold, that jump brings us to negative 3. Because if I do 1 minus 4, I get negative 3. So there you go. 2 different methods. You can use the formula and back solve, or you could use this jump method. Alright, this video was about the midpoint formula. We learned about trying to find the midpoint from 2 endpoints, and we also learned about finding the endpoint from a given midpoint and the other endpoint. Good luck studying.